it's been really fascinating to listen to Emma and Joe and actually just see, even hear, both see and hear lots of connections with my own work as well. So hopefully everyone can see that, can they? You can see that slide okay, yeah. Because I'm on a different tab, so I'll assume, unless Kevin jumps in, that everything's moving as it should. So yeah, I chose this photograph just to kick off because I found it when I was moving house. It's taken in Glasgow. I have no idea what the negatives are anymore, but when I was at Glasgow University back in the early 90s, I was very interested. I was very into hip hop culture, and I was very interested in graffiti, and I took this ostensibly for the piece and on the wall at the bottom, but it's sort of interesting now thinking about the context of this particular session and place, and you know, this very sort of characteristic kind of tower block that are so common in particularly in Glasgow and Edinburgh. This is a shortened version of the ream that Kevin had to read there, but basically my work is looking at home and culture, and I'm really interested in this idea of insider-outsider dynamics, which I'll talk about a little bit more, and also autoethnography. I do some writing around that as well. I'm not going to make you suffer that, so I'm going to mostly just share some photographs, which hopefully will do the talking for me. Just want to give you a chance to read that quote from James Baldwin. And this really kind of, this sort of strikes a chord with me, because some of my work looks at this kind of identity and this culture that is inherited, but I think also because I've lived away for so long, I've kind of stepped outside that and perhaps in some ways created a different cage for myself, but that was something that I was able to choose rather than something that was sort of, you know, came through birth and through sort of happenstance. Probably there's two places which predominantly define a lot of my work. One is Japan. This is a Chinese restaurant in my old neighborhood of Shimokitazawa in Tokyo, where I lived for nearly 20 years. And this is Chinese takeaway in Sandy Row, where I discovered where my grandfather was born, and also discovered through researching my family history that many of my family originated from as well once they had moved to Belfast. And so I think there's a shadow, if not spectre, of these two places that kind of permeates a lot of my work. So thinking about place and architecture, I'm also an Ulster Protestant, so I'm quite contrary. So I lived in Tokyo for a long time, and many times people would say things to me like, oh, it must be very tough living there. You know, it's so futuristic and it's so sort of way ahead. And I recognize that in some ways, but also I recognize the Tokyo where you still get fax machines and convenience stores, where a lot of things are done in paper. It's a cash society and so on and so forth. So I started looking at kind of buildings that I think were sort of contrary to this idea of Tokyo being this kind of futuristic landscape. Ironically, this is actually gone. This kind of New York style graffiti is gone, and there's actually a huge kind of glass and steel building that has now replaced that empty space that I used to pass every morning on my way to work. But there's so many places like this in Japan where it's the exact opposite. They're small, pokey little buildings made from prefab materials, very vulnerable to earthquakes and so on and so forth. And so probably one of the first projects where I was looking really explicitly at architecture was this idea of this Tokyo monochrome, and just finding all these kind of buildings in Japan that sort of bucked against this idea of it being some sort of futuristic landscape. So in Tokyo then, and this is probably less architecturally focused, but I think it is centered around the idea of place, which is my Tokyo Jazz Joints project. And Tokyo Jazz Joints is a documentation of what are known in Japan as jazz kisa, which is basically jazz listening cafes, jazz coffee shops. As a music fan, and a lot of the work I've done around musical subcultures as well led really nicely into this. But I was conscious that these places, because of the age of many of the owners, some of them have been open for 30, 40, 50 years, are starting to disappear. And so I started in 2014. I had this idea in 2015. I started in earnest to photograph these places. And to date, the project's still going. I've photographed about 260 of them. And what they are is a place like this, often dark, dingy, and full of records, full of music. And the music is very much the central part of it. So it's a very specifically constructed place. It's designed around jazz. It's designed around listening to music. And that is the purpose of these places. But they do also, in many cases, have very interesting external architecture as well, like this one kind of almost like shantytown type building that somehow is clinging on in this very suburban new town kind of neighborhood, which is surrounded by newly constructed houses and families. But as you can see, this is stick on the left, and then a few months later, this was stick. So these places are vanishing at an incredible rate. And so I set myself to kind of preserving the memory of these places and preserving the interior, particularly of these places, for posterity. This place is also gone. It was there since 1967, and then within months it had disappeared. And we later discovered also that the owner had sadly passed away. As you can see, again, some of these places no city planning, no sense of fitting in with the surrounding aesthetic. It's all about the music. And this sits again in a very suburban neighborhood run by an elderly couple. And I suspect once that goes and once they go, this building will be razed and replaced with these sort of identikit houses that you see just to the right of the frame. Again, these buildings are almost like pseudo-religious places. They're kind of sacred. They're based around the worship of music, and you can see even the similarities in the way the furniture is set up in the interior. On the left, you can see a jazz kisa called Eiga-kan. On the right, you can see a traditional Japanese shrine. So the speakers and the amp kind of taking the place of these kind of holy relics that you get in Shinto and Buddhist shrines and temples. Again, a place for preservation. This is a toilet door from the original jazz kisa when it burned down. The owner, the only thing he managed to rescue is the toilet door, which he has now got fitted on the wall of the new place, again, as a way of preserving that history of the place. And similarly here, jazz legends have come to these places, signed records, jammed and played live as well. And so, as Kevin said, the Tokyo Jazz Joints was published in 2023. It's subsequently in fourth edition. There's a Japanese version has come out. And I think for me, it's interesting that the world, there's kind of almost a global awareness or interest now in jazz kisa culture. And I think part of that is to do with yearning for a place which is different to the places, so many of the places that we go now. If you go to a pub, there's a TV on. There's perhaps slot machines that are making noise. People are on their phones. People are doing video calls. And yet these jazz kisa have preserved this kind of almost silent, reverent space where you go in, you do one thing without distraction, you sit and listen to the music, and you can shut out all the kind of distractions of the world outside. So this is kind of a fascinating aspect, I think, of photographing these in terms of the concept of place. How are we doing for time? Okay, I need to crack on. So this Coltrane quote sort of underpins a lot of what I do, because in 2017, I moved back to Ireland after almost 20 years in Japan. And one of the projects that I did in Dublin, particularly during COVID, which focused specifically on a type of architecture, was Bard. And what I noticed all of a sudden, very quickly in the city centre, almost in an apocalyptic sense, these hoardings started to go up across pubs as if for some reason they were going to be, kind of stormed and raided. And I think in those days, we can all remember that kind of feeling, and people maybe were tapping into Hollywood movies and expecting something that never really happened. But it was kind of a fascinating aspect of Dublin, particularly where pubs is such a central part of the culture. And then all of a sudden there was nothing there but these boards. And they started to then evolve over time during COVID. People started to kind of match them to the exterior, and in some cases as well, paint them then to make them fit better. And for me, also, there's a kind of a dual focus here, because Dublin is a city that is the capital of at least one of the passports which I own. And I have a very kind of complicated relationship with the city. I think that there's a sort of a love-hate relationship that I have. So, and having lived there for 4 years, I never fully felt at home. I never fully felt like I really got my foot in the door. In some ways, perhaps these kind of images can function as a metaphor for that, as well as being barred or shut out. Which brings me on to my main project at the moment as part of my PhD research, which is entitled I Am or I Am Not. And this is, as Kevin said, a kind of personal exploration of Orange Halls. On summer trips home, for many years, I would drive around, I would be out in the car, and I was fascinated by the Orange Halls all around the countryside and how kind of odd so many of the buildings were. To the point where I eventually applied for a PhD at Ulster, and the purpose being to kind of document and also explore my own identity through the architecture of these buildings. This is one of the first images I took during COVID, I think. This is actually, ironically, in Monaghan, but again, this Orange Hall rapidly being reclaimed by nature. More often, of course, they look a little bit like this. Often I describe them as almost being plonked in a landscape. They often don't bear a lot of resemblance to the landscape around them. And it's almost like some cases they've been dropped from space, which I think, again, to me is interesting in terms of the way photographing a building can be a statement, or the building itself can be a statement in that particular landscape. There's all various types of Orange Halls. This kind of almost Art Deco one up in Castle Rock in the North Coast. This one on the left, I couldn't get any closer than this, but in actual fact, ironically, it's completely disused. Now, as you can see, the doors hanging off the hinges behind this wire gate. Some traditional heritage buildings, I suppose, in the traditional sense. 1898, God Save the Queen. That's not Queen Elizabeth, that was actually Queen Victoria. So again, an interesting building. And I'm really fascinated by the kind of incongruity between this beautiful old, almost countryside type building, and then this steel door with a padlock, which again is reminiscence, I suppose, more of Troubles architecture. And again, often these buildings are completely and utterly unmarked. The only indication here is the tattered Union flag there just at the top. And often Orange Halls as well, they also have these grills on the windows, which is sometimes a giveaway. There are more kind of makeshift buildings, should we say, in the countryside, which again are reminiscent of the mission halls and gospel halls that Kevin mentioned. And again, often this very odd contrast between quite a domestic door and then again this very aggressive steel shutter with, again, the coded curbstones, which anyone who's grown up in Northern Ireland of a certain age will be very familiar with as a marker of territories. I'm fascinated also by the windows in these buildings. There's often a lot of windows, but they're very narrow. They don't let in a lot of light, and they certainly wouldn't let anyone in or out. And this is, again, one of the things that fascinates me about Orange Halls. Sometimes I wonder, are they designed to keep people in, or are they designed to keep people out? This building on the left here, you see, actually has steel plates inside of the building to protect the building, not the glass on the outside. And as I photograph more and more, there's actually about 700 right across Ulster, 650 in the 6 counties of Northern Ireland. And this topology is starting to develop. You have these kind of gable walls. You have these handleless on the right. You have these handleless doors. You also have this kind of sense of fortress-like architecture. And again, coded drain pipes, but also sort of almost Troubles-like architecture in terms of the steel grills on the windows. Not always the case in certain areas. And again, that's a fascinating aspect of it, because often the way that the Orange Hall is dressed, the way that it is protected, gives you a sense of the demography of the area, and in some cases, how that demographic has changed over time. So that is just a quick look at some of the Orange Halls that I've so far photographed. I'm about 350 Orange Halls in, and it's interesting that Joe was talking about getting hold of. So I think part of the impulse of the project is I have the kind of record collector's mentality. So there's something that drives you on to find the next hall, to see if that's the one. And you don't necessarily know what you're looking for, but you kind of know when you find it, in the same way that when you flick through a record box, it's only sometimes when you find the thing that you're looking for, you realize, that's what it was. And similarly, also then Joe's quote about getting hold of the building, I think there's an element of in this particular project and looking at that identity, a Protestant identity that I inherited by birth and politics that I inherited by birth, but have subsequently moved away from, where you're kind of controlling the narrative yourself. And you can see even from these particular photos, the way that I'm framing them very specifically in a certain way. I'm also photographing them as a kind of a traditional archive, like in a kind of an estate agent shot of each of the buildings. But what I'm really fascinated from a photography and an artistic point of view is how these buildings can be shot, particularly in this very flat kind of deadpan way. It's also taken me to Newfoundland. I was lucky to get some funding a couple of summers, and incredibly on the island of Newfoundland in Canada, there's about 40 orange halls in various states of disrepair. And I thought I should include this photograph just because it was the one that was on the poster, but it forms a very interesting counterpart, I think, compared with the halls in Northern Ireland, and perhaps also offers a future for so many orange halls in Northern Ireland, which will inevitably eventually become fall into disuse and disrepair as the membership of the Orange Order declines. And so, you know, Newfoundland offers one example where not this building, but many of the orange halls have been repurposed as community centres, as museums, as cultural centres, and in some cases as private residences as well. So I'm going to flick through really quickly a few more slides. I don't want to take up any more time than I should. This is East Belfast. Was a way of, when I moved back to Belfast in 2021, kind of exploring the area that I move around. And it was interesting again for Emma, when Emma mentioned about cameras. This is shot entirely on smartphone. I'm a huge fan of the smartphone. And if you're interested, particularly in the calendar competition and using that, I think don't be afraid of using your smartphone. There's great quality cameras on many smartphones now. And they'll give you just as good images. What they also do is they give you a mobility, they give you a flexibility and adaptability that you wouldn't necessarily have with a camera. So I started to document the area. I'm not from East Belfast, I'm from South Belfast originally. This was kind of a way of getting to know my area. And there were so many things in it that I recognized, but also it felt different enough to be a new place for me. And this was published as a zine. So I kind of deliberately paired some of these images together. And I think, again, you know, Joe said he photographs in a kind of a straightforward way. I think I do the same. I do like to find humor potentially if I can. This is one example, Peace or Protocol, which was all around East Belfast at one point. But I do approach it from a documentary point of view. I photograph what I see. And if there's humor in that scene, then all the better. And this then inspired me to start playing with some images and putting together diptychs. This was in the RHA this year, where I found these two photographs and I thought they worked nicely together. We've got a drive-in gospel meeting on the left, and on the right, obviously, these balaclavas on a car. And I think, again, religion and politics is something that's kind of always threaded through a lot of my work, particularly the work shot in Ireland. So very quickly then, just other ways of photographing place that I was thinking about. Two cranes, Kevin mentioned. This, I think, particularly in the context of the rise in hate crime and racist incidents in Belfast, was kind of interesting, even more interesting now than perhaps a year ago. But I wanted to acknowledge the long-standing Chinese community in Belfast. I wanted to also acknowledge how integral they are in the urban environment, and also Chinese food, how integral it is in the culinary culture of the city. So I started to photograph some of the older Chinese around Belfast. With permission, I spoke to each of the owners and shot these as part of a Two Cranes exhibition in February. And this work was sponsored by the Arts Council Individual Artist Award. And then just a couple more things. Another way I looked at photographing place was looking at flags. Again, most areas of the city, flags are generally a marker of territory. But I thought about kind of trying to take away that power, trying to take away that intimidatory aspect that they have, and making them a bit more ethereal by photographing them just as shadows and in black and white as well. but to anyone from the region, particularly Northern Ireland, this will be very recognizable, obviously, as well. And then finally, I played around with some of my Orange Halls photographs as well, using kind of digital collage, and thought about how to reimagine place completely. So I took out some of the closed windows and doors, and I put my own insides or my own interiors into these photographs as well. Also as a way perhaps of controlling the buildings or taking control of that narrative as well. And this obviously was a horse in Dublin, which again reminiscent of a white horse seen on many walls around Belfast and other towns and cities. I'm going to skip through this, I think, and just go right to the end and just say thank you.